or energy.
Yeah. Yeah, there's like one place in that, because it's actually one of those camps that's really rural. All the cabins, there's no electricity or anything like that. So you're living on flashlight power and all that. Up at the main place, they kind of have like some sort of public Wi-Fi that you can maybe get on, check messages and stuff like that. But
No doubt it's not very good though.
yeah, yeah. So what we're talking about is that next week I will be at a camp in St. Croix State Park in Minnesota, and we won't be able to do the Bible ABC next week, but we'll put word out for the week after that.
How do the kids typically handle that? The no electricity and all that. Are they pretty cool about it, or is that pretty tough for some of them?
No, they're pretty good about it. So, although northern kids are they're wired different than most kids, I'd say.
Yeah, they're probably more used to it.
Yeah. No, it's actually it's quite nice. It's quite fun to kind of unplug and disconnect and, hear the porcupine scratching underneath the cabin and like all the interesting sounds. Because they don't even have windows. It's like, it's like the old cabins, I think built, I don't even know, 20s or 30s or something. And they've just got screens and then like wood shutters that you close at night or leave open if it's warm. So
that's pretty fun.
Yeah, it'll be fun. It'll be a good time.
Somebody asked me, when I was talking last week, Cody Slammons, he asked me, he was like, did you go to Minnesota camp? I was like, nope, I never have my whole life. But I think what happened is he had gone through Atlanta because he was with a friends group there.
Mm-hmm.
And
same summer. Remember where?
Yeah, we figured out we had met there in Atlanta when I was living there. And I'm guessing it was the same year he had gone or whatever to Minnesota.
Yeah.
So, anyway, what do you think? You want to get the thing going?
Yeah, let's do it. There's a couple of people. I mean,
awesome.
Says there's 3, that 2 of them might be us, but
that's good enough. So we're in the second half of James 2, and James has been taking us through a lot of really down to earth kinds of things about how we need to live our lives, how we need to treat other people, how we need to think about troubles. All this really rich and layered, but I love we've talked about this every time, so it's kind of broken record time, I guess, but it's great that he makes the big stuff about being a Christian that sometimes can seem so intangible and hard to grab onto. He says, all right, look, here's what it means in your real life. But also it's, hey, this stuff that seems like just simple little things that you're doing, it's the biggest stuff. Actually, it's the thing that's really changing you. It's the stuff that's drawing you closer to God. It's the stuff that God's using to make you into what you ought to be. So I love that. And it's especially true in this section today, talking about faith in the second half of chapter 2. But I don't know what else you think we need to say before we read it.
Yeah, I mean, we've kind of pointed out that James bookends his writing with the idea that we're going to be blessed when we overcome our trials. And part of what I get the sense of here in chapter 2 is that some of the trial we need to overcome is like the trial of service or the trial of like continually doing what we're supposed to. Mm-hmm. I think a lot of times we think of trials almost just in the sense of like something happening to us, but a lot of Christian suffering or trial is like actively engaging in service and doing good. And then not growing weary, but persevering in it. And I think that's a lot of what's going on here in chapter 2 is applying what he said in chapter 1, being doers of the word and not just hearers. This is the way that we're going to persevere and find blessing in life.
Awesome. All right, James 2, verse 14. What use is it, my brothers, if someone says he has faith, but he has no works? Can that faith save him? If a brother or sister is without clothing and in need of daily food, and one of you says to them, go in peace, be warmed and be filled, yet you do not give them what is necessary for their body, what use is that? In the same way, faith also, if it has no works, is dead, being by itself. Someone may well say, you have faith and I have works. Show me your faith without the works, and I will show you my faith by my works. You believe that God is one. You do well. The demons also believe and shudder. But are you willing to acknowledge, you foolish person, that faith without works is useless? Was our father Abraham not justified by works when he offered up his son Isaac on the altar? You see that faith was working with his works. And as a result of the works, faith was perfected. And the scripture was fulfilled, which says, and Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. And he was called a friend of God. You see that a person is justified by works and not by faith alone. In the same way, was Rahab the prostitute not justified by works also when she received the messengers and sent them out by another way? For just as the body without the spirit is dead, so also faith without works is dead.
Very good. A lot of good things to talk about here. Going back up to verse 14, and he asks kind of this rhetorical question: what use is it if somebody says he has faith? That's kind of like in chapter 1 when he was like, what use is it if people hear the word?
Yeah.
What use is it if people think they're religious? What use is it if people think they're wise? Like, James kind of keeps bringing up, stuff that really gets to me, because I like to think of myself as a hearer and faithful and wise and like but part of what James does with us is he doesn't let us just get away with that superficial stuff. Maybe this is a good question to sort of ask too. What does faith actually have to do with works anyway? Isn't faith something that we do in our heads and in our heart, and isn't it toward God? Why is James sort of indicating that this faith that we have has to manifest itself in service and love for others? It's kind of how he said it at the beginning of chapter 2 also: don't hold your faith in our glorious Lord with partiality. But I thought faith was about like me and God. It wasn't horizontal. And yet James keeps bringing us back to, if we genuinely say we are people of faith, then that trust in God has to manifest itself by us letting go of our goods, letting go of our ego, letting go of our position, and making sure that trusting God looks a certain way in the lives of other people.
Yeah. That is one of the big, we've talked about it before, but it's one of the biggest easy mistakes to make for some reason in religious stuff and things related to Christ, is we can forget just that faith, belief, those words, they're not just these abstract conceptual kinds of things. They dictate everything about our lives. I've thought about that some. So my favorite basketball team, the Atlanta Hawks, are in the playoffs, second round, worst seed in the playoffs, like shouldn't be this far. It's really exciting and fun. But the little slogan for the team all year, like on all their social media, on the t-shirt at the playoff games, all that stuff, is believe. And that's what the coach has been able to believe. You got to believe. You got to believe. Well, the point of that is not just you guys should think some stuff. The whole point is that should dictate the way the effort you put forth and the way you follow the game plan, the way you trust each other and help each other. And all. It's weird. In every other arena of life, we know concepts like belief or faith, which belief is only one part of faith anyways. Like you said, belief means you're going to trust God actively, means you're going to be obedient, means you're going to be loyal. But even if you just go with that fundamental understanding of faith as belief, everybody knows if you really believe something, it demands action. And it's not enough to say, oh, I believe in God. I've got to actually respond in some sort of way. I got to live in a certain way. I got to reorient my life, my behavior, my speech, everything because of that thing that I think in my head and my heart.
Yeah, very good. James' question in verse 14, when he says at the end, can that faith save him? One of the things we should be really concerned about is, am I really going to be saved by God? And James describes a kind of faith, and really the question implies this kind of faith isn't going to save you. But the second thing he does in these verses is he says that kind of faith is also not going to help anyone else.
Yeah.
It's not going to help you, and it's not going to help them. In this almost funny illustration where he says, if you see somebody who's in need of daily food, if they're lacking clothing, if somebody's really in trouble, going through a hard thing, and deep in your heart, you actually think, oh man, I want them to be at peace. I want them to be warm. I want them to be filled. I pray for that. I hope for that. James basically says, so what? Like, what does that do to help them be warmed and filled? What does that help? How does that help them? Uh,
Yeah.
have you noticed how easy it is nowadays for social media to sort of perpetuate this? Like, we see each other across the country, we hear you're going through a hard time, and then you know, at least we care enough to send a nice, hey, I hope this goes well. Peace, be filled. Like, I'm rooting for you, I'm praying for you. And again, practically, we can't be everywhere at the same time. We live in a world that's so big now. Back then, you had no way of hearing the news until it was long gone, if it's somebody somewhere else. But that does mean that we really should be paying attention to people close to us, um, and being very active in the things that we do. Um, it always inspires me when somebody's going through something and everybody on social media is like praying for you, rooting for you, whatever they're doing. And then I find out somebody showed up, you
It's
know, somebody got on a plane, somebody drove to them, somebody's there. They didn't make a public display of like what they wanted for this person. They just went and took care of them. Something about that always kind of gets to me too. Like, I'm not always that guy.
yeah. Yeah. And the times when I'm not, this passage, like you said, there's two things. One, that's not saving faith. Two, that's not helpful faith. So
Right.
it's not good for me and God, and it's not good for anybody else. I think kind of the most disturbing part about this, though, which again, it almost feels like he's kind of a little bit almost tongue in cheek with, except it's not funny at all, really, when you really think about it. The comparison he makes in verse 19 is, if your faith isn't leading you to some sort of action, cool, that's great. Demons have the same kind of faith.
Yeah.
Well, demons are not in any way in harmony with God. They're not safe with God. And demons are not only not helping people, they're destroying people.
Yeah.
So, and I guess I should say, it's not just that they're not safe with God, they're punished by God. They're under condemnation before God. They believe in God. And the other thing to me about verse 19 that's striking is they even have an emotional response to God.
Right.
I think that's the point of they shudder. I don't know all of what all that means, but they shudder. And this verse, it really hits me with that, is I can have an emotional response to God, or an emotional response to what I should do in response to God. But if I don't actually do anything, if I don't actually carry out that faith and whatever emotions may accompany that faith with some sort of works, that faith is demon faith, and it's really useless, and worse than useless. It's destructive, both for me and, like you said, for other people, which is what he kind of, the illustration he uses here. So that's pretty jolting, verse 19, that faith without works is dead and it's demonic, really.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, well said. I've wondered about, what does that mean, the demons shudder? And I have to imagine what that's kind of saying is it makes them afraid. Like, they recognize, because of who God is and what they believe, that he's got power over them. You can see the way the demons reacted when Jesus was in his ministry, and he'd show up and they'd be like, wait, what are you doing here? Are you going to destroy us before the time? And they knew that God held power over them. But think about it like this: how often does that sense in us make us believe we really trust God or know God? I mean, if we're afraid of, like, God judging us, it does mean that we believe in him. It does mean that we know he's there.
Yeah.
But that's not enough for the kind of faith that's living and active and helpful. There's a passage that we've studied when we studied First John, this idea that perfect love casts out fear. Isn't that kind of what James is saying here? You want to not just be somebody who shudders when you think about God, then go take care of somebody who needs clothing and needs help, and go love them, go actively love, and watch how your attitude really of God will even change. I'm not just afraid of God anymore. I'm actively working with God, and I feel alive now. So does my faith. My faith isn't fretting the future. I'm
Mhm.
sort of rejoicing in it. So a living faith in that way is really amazing.
Yeah. And not only is it something that has like eternally saving properties where, hey, God is pleased with me and I'm going to be safe with him forever. And it benefits other people. But in verse 20, he says, but are you willing to acknowledge, you foolish person, that faith that works is useless?
Mm-hmm.
And it could be this thing about the usefulness that we should be pursuing for other people, but it's also useful for me. To your point about fear, whenever Jesus talked about people who are anxious, like sort of a chosen anxiety, not clinical anxiety necessarily, but the anxiety of thinking about, oh, what are we going to eat? What are we going to drink? What are we going to wear? And getting all worked up over that stuff. The thing that Jesus points to as the real problem is you're people of little faith. And his expression of what kind of faith would help people overcome that anxiety is, but seek first his kingdom and his righteousness. Do something, and all these other things will be added to you. So it's really useful to be a person of faith. There's sort of a pragmatism to this of, if I'm a person of faith, I am going to have fewer anxieties. I'm not going to be free of those. And there may be clinical things, biochemistry things that I still have to deal with. But as far as some of the types of anxiety people have over politics or money, faith is useful in that it's going to liberate me from that because I'm trusting in God and serving God. Um, my relationships where people around me just have really damaged relationships, everybody's always mad at them. They're always mad at people. If I'm really a faithful person, I'm going to be forgiving and as gentle as I can be, or humble and willing to acknowledge when I wasn't gentle and try to repair those relationships. So it's really useful to be a person of faith because I don't have to deal with bad relationships all the time with everybody. And you can just go on down the list. I mean, about my sexual behavior, my behavior with money, my work ethic, all that stuff. If I'm really a person of faith, it's something that saves. It's something that will benefit others, and it's something that's really useful for me in dealing with a lot of the troubles that the world brings upon us.
Yeah, it changes us. Like it really does change us. Um, all right, so this is one of those passages that I grew up hearing and knowing, and I could say all of it. And faith without works is dead. Faith without works is dead. Like these illustrations of him using death as the way of describing this. But we also, so there's a couple things. Number one, we learn a little bit about what death means in this text. Death means biblically separation.
Mm-hmm.
Body from spirit is physical death. Spirit from God is spiritual death. But here he's using this illustration to say, like, faith without works is just like that. It's this dead thing. Now, here's where growing up, I finally began to realize this illustration probably would have made more of an impact on the people of that time. Most of us haven't seen people die. Like, most of us grow up and people die in a place where we're not there. In the ancient world, people would die in your home. Everybody be surrounding the bed. But I grew up, and most of the people that died, I'd either hear about them dying or even my own family. My mom, I didn't watch her die. Like, I wasn't in the room. But I remember the first time I finally did see somebody die. Like, have you been in a place where somebody did?
Somebody like pulled me out of the room and was like, "Hey, man, I want to tell you what's about to happen," even because it's not like the movies where the person just like drifts or whatever.
Yes. So really, it's only once so far for you?
My grandpa, yeah.
Yeah. So now, I mean, in my life, it's happened probably dozens of times, or a couple.
Yeah.
I've been in a place where people have died many times. I'll tell you what, when that finally happens to you, and you watch the difference between a living body, and a dead body, in a moment where like the life leaves them, the spirit leaves them, and you can look at them if you know them, and you think, there they are, but it's not them. And it's like you recognize them, but it's so different to not have life in them.
From like 2 minutes ago, or 90 seconds ago.
Yes. I'll tell you, when I finally began to think about that in relation to this passage, it made me more determined to not have the kind of faith that he describes here.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's so disturbing
Yeah.
like to be around a body that's dead. And I think James is probably writing this for people that knew that and felt that. They could think of all their loved ones where they had seen the separation between the body and the spirit. They knew what that person was recognizable, but it wasn't them.
Mhm.
And James is using this as an illustration to say, like, do not fool yourselves into thinking that this kind of proclamation that you make about your faith is really faith,
Yeah.
or that these superficial ways of measuring faith are really faith. It's a striking illustration.
Yeah. And sobering because of that, like you said. I mean, it's not just a theoretical, like dead and alive, like you said, are theoretical for us a lot of times. It was a really sobering deal. I think the examples he uses too of trying to explain or illustrate what a working faith really looks like are pretty sobering in a different way in terms of they have a lot of gravity to them,
Yeah.
of the lengths that I've got to be willing to go to not have a faith that's basically a corpse, you know. So with the Abraham one, well, I guess to me, the Abraham one to me is interesting. So I guess I'll mention something about Rahab first. The Rahab one to me is very parallel to this whole chapter, where this whole chapter is about helping people.
Right.
Verses 1 through 13, show mercy to the poor person who comes in among you and don't show partiality. And then even the first illustration he uses to talk about faith, he doesn't talk about, if you say you have faith, but you're not baptized, can that faith save you? By the way, I think that's a fine application of this concept, but his application is not that. His application is, you didn't help somebody who is in need. How can you say that? And that's his parallel, and the kind of his application is, well, Rahab, she gets commended because her faith in God, the God who had destroyed Pharaoh and his armies and mowed down the Canaanite nations as Israel came close to Jericho. She believed in that God. And so she helped these men. And that's what it says in verse 25. And I know this one can get tricky and complicated, where it's like, well, is this commending that she blah, blah, blah? The thing that she gets commended for is she helped the guys.
Yeah.
And that's as far as I'm really willing to say. Like, I don't know that she knew how to do that. And sometimes when we're trying to live by faith, we're still growing and figuring stuff out. But anyway, she helped the guys. And so faith led her. Here's God's people. I'm believing in this God. So that means I need to help these people. So she helped somebody. It's interesting. The Abraham example is kind of sort of the opposite. Like, it was not about helping somebody. But there's a lot of rich layers to the Abraham story here, and the lessons I think we get for what it means to really have faith. It's not a dead corpse, but it's really alive.
Yeah. Charity made a comment on the thread here that says, we can't see anyone's faith, but we can see the kind of faith they have by what they do. And then she commented, like Abraham. I'm struck by the fact that when Paul uses Abraham as an example in the book of Romans, like Romans chapter 4, his whole focus is on God attributed Abraham's belief and trust. Abraham believed in God, and it was accounted to him for righteousness. And that's an interesting thing to think about. Just like Rahab, when she finally met the Israelites, she knew about things that happened 40 years before, and ways that God had demonstrated his power. And she's like, I know who you are. We heard what you've done. Her expressions of faith and belief, I believe, were accounted for righteousness. They were. There's something to that. But now James uses Abraham and says, well, what if Abraham hadn't obeyed God?
Yeah.
What if Rahab hadn't done something, to help God's people do what they were there to do? What about that? What would have amounted to the fact that they believed God if they weren't willing to go ahead and obey God and do what God asked? So going back to the Abraham thing, in chapter 22 of Genesis, when he takes Isaac all the way to Mount Moriah, climbs the hill, ties him up, raises the knife, and God says, stop, don't hurt the lad. Do you remember what he said next? Now I know that you fear me.
Yep.
And I know there's a question somebody might ask, well, couldn't God know before whether Abraham feared him? Yeah, perhaps so. But that doesn't change the fact that God said, once he raised the knife, now I know that you fear me.
See it.
I see it.
Yeah.
Like, why would God be any different than we are? That he knows us by our fruit, not by our potential. You know, Jesus would curse trees based on whether or not they had fruit, not whether or not they were a certain kind of tree. We're told that we'll know people by their fruit, but then we imagine that God's different. You know, well, God knows my heart. God knows my heart. God knows my heart.
Yeah.
Or God's doing exactly what he told us to do, and he's measuring us by our fruit.
Yeah.
Um,
And another thing that is interesting is I've thought before, okay, so what this passage is saying is in Genesis 15, it gets said that Abraham believed, like he accepted the thing that God told him about future generations, and God counted that for righteousness. And then this passage is saying that was fulfilled, like you just said, whenever he actually obeyed. Like, okay, so it was sort of like we're counting it, and then bam, he sort of cashes in on it later on, years later in Genesis 22. But then the funny thing to me is, well, wait, Abraham was already obeying God. Like he already was having an active faith. He went out from his home country. He had done other things that were acts of faith. So I think what this shows is that also the works of faith are obedience, but also loyalty or faithfulness. Like,
Yeah.
I didn't just obey God that one time, or I don't just obey God in certain parts of my life.
Yeah.
I have a comprehensive devotion and loyalty to God. And that means I'm going to work based on that devotion in every aspect of my life. And in the more dramatic and challenging and hard things that God calls me to do, I'm going to do those things. The things that make the least amount of sense to me, like, hey, take your only son who I promised I was going to use to bring about multitudes and bless the world. I want you to kill that son. How is that possible, God? If you have faith, then you'll do it,
right.
Or be willing to do it, as Abraham was. Well, I mean, the Hebrew writer says he was just as good as dead. Like Abraham had done it in his mind and his heart, and then he was doing it in his body. So I think that's another great lesson here, that faith isn't just a work, but it's all the works that God calls us to do. We're always pursuing how to be obedient to him in that comprehensive way in every aspect of our lives, even when it's most challenging and confusing and not what I expected, or not even what I think God told me to do.
Yeah. Yeah. Good. That's really good. So you brought something up a minute ago that I think I want to address here as we get close to the end. This is the passage we normally go to when we're trying to convince some of our friends who believe that they're saved by faith alone, or, you know, just all you got to do is have faith. And we want to bring them here to prove something about like baptism or whatever. Fair. And I think that's a proper thing to do with a text like this. The only time the words faith and alone take place together in scripture is here in verse 24. And it says not by faith alone. So that's a great challenge to people that say, oh yeah, I believe you're saved by faith alone. And you say, do you know what verse in the Bible actually uses those words together? They normally don't. And if you say, well, the only place they take place in the same like phrase is here in this text, and then they read it out loud and they're like, wait, what? But here's the point. If I'm the kind of person that uses a text like this to say, hey, people that believe in God and have faith, they need to obey God and be baptized. James is going a step further. Like you said, that's not his concern. He's concerned for those of us that have already made that choice, asking ourselves, go back through chapter 2, am I being partial to people? Am I treating people differently because of their status or what they can do for me? If so, my faith is as dead as the person who refuses to obey God initially. Or am I helping those that need help around me? Yep. Am I actually actively loving people? I mean, let alone baptism, like let alone the initial steps. This is written to people who claim to have faith and could maybe even point to some of those things they've done and say, of course, I believe faith without works is dead because I did these initial works. James is thinking about things further down the line.
Yeah. And you could back that all the way up. the very first time he talks about faith in this book is about asking God for wisdom when we're going through trials without any doubting. And then when we go through temptation, do we have faith? I mean, what do our works, what are our lives showing? He's going to use the same kind of language later in chapter 3. It's super challenging. And this is, I think, for me, I've got to remind myself exactly what you said every time. This is not a passage for you or for them. When I read this, I've got to ask myself. I mean, that's what James is doing. He's asking me, what about it? Like, tell me, how are you living? What are you doing? And that's maybe the reason I'm so quick to think about just this on a conceptual level, or think about other people or whatever religious problems in the world related to this, is because it's pretty uncomfortable to really examine myself in terms of my attitude, my actions, my relationships, the way everything. But if we want to be alive, if we want to be safe with God, if we want to have a useful faith, we got to take this thing really seriously.
Yeah, very good. You know, there in verse 20, when James says, "Are you willing to recognize, you foolish fellow?" Like, I have that marked in my Bible with a little note next to it that says, "That's me." Like, are you willing to recognize, you foolish fellow, that these games you play in your own head, trying to convince yourself or whoever else that you're faithful and that you love God, are you willing to recognize that if what I'm describing is you, it's useless and it's dead and it's not going to count for anything?
Yep. That's right. All right. But the great thing is we get a blueprint here and a little reminder for how we can do better. So let's do it. Let's pick it up and keep it moving. So like we said at the beginning, we're going to be off next week. And then you can just keep track of the page or whatever for notifications for whenever we're able to get back on it. Probably this summer, there'll be a little more in and out stuff anyways, but we're going to do our best to try to keep it going.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks everybody for joining us. Always good to have you with us.
See y'all next time.